Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. C.G. Jung, The Paradox of Silence. Why words never spoken can shout the loudest. The phone screen remains dark. 3 days now, no notifications, no messages, no explanation, just digital silence. Your mind races through every possible scenario: illness, accident, anger, disinterest, while your emotions swing wildly between concern, indignation, and a crushing sense of rejection. Nothing triggers such profound existential anxiety as deliberate silence from someone whose voice we long to hear. Why does being ignored create such unbearable pain? What ancient mechanism within our psyche makes absence of communication feel like an assault on our very existence? The Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung would suggest that when we suffer from another's silence, we are not merely experiencing social discomfort, we are encountering our own shadow projected onto the blank canvas of their absence. In the vast landscape of psychological wounds, few cut as deeply or persistently as deliberate silence. The technical term, ostracism, derives from ancient Greek practices where citizens would write the names of dangerous individuals on pottery shards, ostraka, to banish them from society. Modern neuroscience confirms what Jung intuited: social rejection activates the same neural pathways as physical pain. When someone ignores us, our brain processes it similarly to a bodily injury, releasing stress hormones that flood our system with the biochemistry of distress, the illusion of disconnection. When silence becomes personal, consider Sarah, a 34-year-old marketing executive who recently interviewed for her dream position. The interview went superbly: warm smiles, engaged questions, promises to be in touch soon. 2 weeks passed without a word. No rejection, no offer, no acknowledgement of her follow-up email. Just organizational silence. Sarah found herself unable to concentrate, checking her email compulsively, and creating elaborate narratives about her inadequacy. Something must be fundamentally wrong with me, she concluded. Something so obvious to them they didn't even bother responding. What Sarah experienced exemplifies Jung's understanding of projection. The silence, neutral in itself, became a screen onto which she projected her deepest insecurities. The absence of communication didn't simply disappoint her, it activated her core wound, the fear of fundamental unworthiness. This pattern repeats daily across countless human interactions. The friend who doesn't respond to texts, the colleague who walks past without acknowledgement, the family member who withholds approval, the romantic partner who withdraws emotionally. In each case, the silence itself carries no inherent meaning, yet we experience it as a definitive statement about our worth, lovability, or right to exist. The archetypal origins. Jung's perspective on rejection sensitivity. Jung would interpret our hypersensitivity to being ignored through several interconnected psychological frameworks. The shadow and projection. At the heart of Jung's psychological model stands the concept of the shadow, the repository of traits, desires, and aspects of ourselves that we deem unacceptable and thus push into unconsciousness. When someone ignores us, this shadow material awakens. Their silence becomes the perfect blank screen onto which we project our own rejected parts. When Jack's new dating prospect suddenly stopped responding after 3 promising dates, his conscious mind told a simple story: she's rude and inconsiderate. But beneath this interpretation lay the projection: I am unlovable, I am worthy of abandonment. The other person's silence merely activated what Jung would call Jack's abandonment complex, a constellation of emotions, memories, and beliefs organized around early experiences of rejection. 2. The collective unconscious and survival archetypes. Our reaction to being ignored extends beyond personal history into what Jung termed the collective unconscious, the shared psychological inheritance of humanity. For our prehistoric ancestors, group belonging meant survival, exclusion meant likely death. This existential equation became encoded in our psychological architecture as an archetype, a universal template for experience. Anthropological research confirms this Jungian insight. Across vastly different cultures, from hunter-gatherer societies to industrialized nations, ostracism ranks among the most severe social punishments, often considered worse than physical violence. The universality of this response suggests precisely what Jung proposed: we carry ancestral memory of exclusion as an existential threat. 3. The individuation process and wholeness. Jung understood psychological development as an individuation process, the lifelong journey toward integrating the disparate parts of our psyche into a cohesive whole. Painful triggers like being ignored serve a potentially transformative purpose within this framework. They bring unconscious material into awareness, offering opportunities to recognize and integrate rejected aspects of ourselves. When we react disproportionately to someone's silence, Jung would encourage us to ask, what part of myself am I encountering in this pain? What rejected aspect of my being seeks recognition? The neuroscience of rejection. Where Jung meets modern research, contemporary neuroscience provides remarkable validation for Jung's insights regarding social pain. Using functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, researchers have documented that social rejection activates the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex and anterior insula, the same brain regions that process physical pain. This neural overlap explains why being ignored doesn't merely disappoint us, it hurts us. Studies on social exclusion reveal a cascade of psychological effects that mirror Jung's understanding of shadow activation. Threatened basic needs. Ostracism undermines four fundamental psychological needs: belonging, self-esteem, control, and meaningful existence, precisely the components Jung identified as essential for psychological wholeness. Facilitated vigilance. After being ignored, subjects demonstrate increased sensitivity to social cues and facial expressions, particularly those signaling rejection, a neurological manifestation of what Jung would call complex activation. Facilitated reduced self-regulation. Exclusion temporarily impairs executive function and self-control, making individuals more likely to act from unconscious impulses, or in Jungian terms, to be driven by shadow material, rather than the conscious ego. Facilitated rejuration impacts memory formation and retrieval, particularly for social information, explaining why painful experiences of being ignored can distort our perception of relationships and personal history. The renowned neuroscientist Matthew Lieberman, whose work focuses on social pain, concluded that social rejection is processed by the brain in a similar way to broken bones. This finding would not have surprised Jung, who understood that psychic wounds could be as real and consequential as physical ones. The historical context. Jung's personal experience with silence. Jung's insights into the psychology of rejection were not merely theoretical. His profound understanding of how silence wounds emerged partly from his own painful experience of being ignored by his former mentor and colleague, Sigmund Freud. The relationship between these two titans of psychology began with mutual admiration, but deteriorated as Jung developed theories that diverged from Freudian orthodoxy. In 1913, after Jung published Transformations and Symbols of the Libido, Freud's response was not argumentative engagement but silence, a complete withdrawal of communication that Jung experienced as a profound betrayal. This professional ostracism triggered what Jung later termed his confrontation with the unconscious, a period of intense psychological crisis during which he descended into what might today be diagnosed as a psychotic episode. For 3 years Jung recorded his hallucinations, visions and dialogues with imaginal figures in the remarkable journal that would later become the Red Book. From this personal crucible emerged Jung's most original contributions to psychology, including his theories of archetypes, the collective unconscious, and notably his nuanced understanding of projection and the shadow. What began as the wound of silence became the birthplace of insight. The cultural dimension, modernity, and the amplification of silence. Jung wrote during a time when being ignored meant unanswered letters or unreturned telephone calls. Today, digital communication has created new dimensions of potential rejection, from seen messages without replies to social media posts that receive no engagement. Research indicates that digital ostracism may be even more psychologically damaging than traditional forms, because solitaire rejuration visibility metrics. Platforms that show when messages have been read but not answered create objective evidence of being ignored, removing doubt and amplifying pain. Facilitated dimension. When rejection occurs in digitally public spaces like social media, it adds the dimension of witnessed humiliation. Simultaneous access. The constant availability of communication channels means that silence becomes increasingly interpreted as deliberate rather than circumstantial. Simultaneous effect. Social media allows immediate comparison between how others respond to us versus to others, highlighting perceived rejection. Jung would likely view these technological developments as amplifiers of ancient psychological dynamics, rather than fundamentally new phenomena. The digital age hasn't created our sensitivity to rejection, it has simply provided new contexts for our shadow material to be activated and projected. The relationship between silence and power, one dimension of being ignored, that Jung explored extensively, involves the power dynamics inherent in communication withdrawal. Silence can function as an assertion of dominance, what Jung would characterize as an expression of the power archetype. In his essay The Relations Between the Ego and the Unconscious, Jung wrote about how power imbalances activate primitive psychological patterns. When someone with perceived authority or importance ignores us, it triggers not only personal insecurity, but archetypal responses related to hierarchy and submission. This explains why being ignored by someone we perceive as above us, a potential employer, a famous person, a romantic interest we idealize, typically wounds more deeply than silence from those we consider equals or subordinates. The power differential activates the archetypal dimension of the experience, connecting our personal pain to collective patterns of dominance and submission. Clinical psychologist Harriet Lerner observed this pattern in therapeutic relationships, noting that silence is never neutral. It is a powerful communication that may support or destroy connection. Jung would add that the destructive potential of silence lies precisely in how it activates our unconscious power dynamics and shadow material. The interpretation of silence, projection versus reality, perhaps the most challenging aspect of being ignored, involves distinguishing between projection and accurate perception. When someone doesn't respond to our outreach, are we correctly interpreting intentional rejection, or are we projecting our insecurities onto a neutral situation? Jung advocated a rigorous practice of differentiating projection from reality, through what he called active imagination, a form of inner dialogue that brings unconscious content into conscious awareness. Through this process we might ask ourselves solital, what evidence supports my interpretation of being deliberately ignored? What alternative explanations exist for this silence? What personal history might be coloring my perception? What emotional patterns am I recognizing from previous experiences? The Jungian analyst James Hollis suggests that whenever we feel emotionally overwhelmed by someone's behavior, we are likely experiencing at least 50% projection. This doesn't invalidate our pain but invites us to examine its origins more carefully. Consider Thomas, who felt deeply wounded when his manager failed to acknowledge his contribution during a team meeting. His immediate interpretation, "My boss doesn't value me," triggered intense feelings of worthlessness and anger. Through self-reflection, Thomas recognized that this reaction connected to his childhood experience of seeking validation from a chronically distant father. While his manager's oversight was real, the intensity of Thomas's reaction revealed the activation of old wounds, his shadow material projected onto the present situation. The double-edged nature of digital communication. Our digital era presents a particular challenge to Jungian understanding of silence and rejection. Social media and instant messaging have created what psychologists call ambient awareness, the sense of constant connection and the expectation of immediate response. Research from the Pew Research Center found that 42% of Americans check their phones within 5 minutes of receiving notifications, and 84% feel uneasy when separated from their devices. This constant connectivity has neurologically rewired our expectations around communication tempo, creating what MIT sociologist Sherry Turkle calls the new silence anxiety, the distress experienced when expected digital responses don't arrive within anticipated timeframes. Jung might interpret this phenomenon as a collective regression to infantile states of attachment, where separation from the caregiver, now symbolized by connection to the digital other, triggers primal abandonment anxiety. The ping of notifications delivers dopamine hits that reinforce our dependency, while their absence activates threat response systems. This technological environment hasn't created our sensitivity to rejection, but it has amplified it by 1. Establishing objective metrics for being ignored, read receipts, online status indicators, 2. Creating social comparison mechanisms, that highlight rejection, seeing others receive responses while we don't. 3. Establishing unrealistic expectations about constant availability. 4. Removing contextual cues that might explain silence. The result is what Jungian analyst James Hollis might call a perfect environment for shadow projection, a world where the ambiguity of digital silence becomes the screen onto which we project our deepest insecurities. The physiological dimension. How silence triggers the stress response. Jung understood that psychological phenomena manifest physically, what he termed the psychoid nature of archetypes. Modern research confirms this insight by documenting how being ignored triggers measurable physiological responses. Solitane, cortisol elevation. Studies show significant increases in stress hormones following experiences of social exclusion. Solitane. Inflammatory response. Rejection activates pro-inflammatory cytokines, linking social pain to physical illness. Solitane. Heart rate variability. Ostracism reduces HRV, indicating activation of the sympathetic nervous system. Solitane. Immune suppression. Prolonged experiences of exclusion correlate with reduced immune function. These physiological markers validate Jung's understanding that archetypal wounds manifest in the body. When someone ignores us, we don't merely think we're hurt. Our bodies enter survival states identical to physical threat responses. Dr. Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory offers a neurobiological framework that complements Jung's psychological insights. According to Porges, social rejection triggers dorsal vagal shutdown, a primitive defensive strategy characterized by withdrawal, dissociation, and immobilization. This state mirrors what Jung described as complex constellations, where unconscious material overwhelms conscious functioning. The question of intention: does it matter why we're being ignored? Jung maintained that psychological impact often operates independently from objective reality or others' intentions. Whether someone deliberately ignores us, or simply fails to respond due to circumstances beyond their control, the activation of our complexes proceeds similarly. This creates a fascinating paradox. Learning that someone didn't intentionally ignore us may provide rational comfort, but doesn't necessarily resolve the unconscious activation that occurred. The shadow material has already been constellated, the wound already inflicted. This psychological reality explains why explanations like "I didn't see your message," or "I've been swamped with work" sometimes fail to fully soothe the pain of perceived rejection. The rational mind accepts the explanation while the unconscious continues responding to the activated complex. Jung would encourage us to use these moments as opportunities for shadow integration, to recognize that the intensity of our reaction reveals something important about our own psychological structure, regardless of the other person's intent. The therapeutic approach. Jung's perspective on healing rejection wounds. For those suffering from the pain of being ignored, Jung would prescribe neither stoic detachment nor passive acceptance, but active engagement with the activated material. His therapeutic approach would likely include 1. Conscious shadow work. The first step involves acknowledging the projection. When someone's silence wounds us deeply, Jung would invite us to ask, what part of myself am I encountering in this pain? What forgotten or rejected aspect seeks integration? The answer often reveals core wounds around worthiness, belonging, or fundamental acceptability, what Jung called the shadow of the self archetype. 2. Active imagination. Jung developed the practice of active imagination as a method for dialoguing with unconscious material. For rejection wounds, this might involve solitane, visualizing the person who ignored you, and having an imaginal conversation. Solitane. Writing dialogue between your conscious self and the wounded part. Solitane. Artistic expression of the feelings triggered by rejection. Working with dreams that emerge during periods of feeling ignored. Through these practices, unconscious content becomes accessible to consciousness, allowing integration rather than projection. 3. Archetypal contextualization. Understanding our reactions within broader human patterns helps depersonalize the pain. Jung would encourage recognition that solitane, the fear of rejection, connects to universal human experience. Your sensitivity reflects both personal history and collective inheritance. The intensity of our reaction often correlates with the depth of potential growth. 4. Symbolic action.
Jung believed in the power of symbolic acts to communicate with the unconscious. For healing rejection wounds, such actions might include solitude, gradual acknowledgement of the pain, creating art that expresses and transforms the experience, physical practices that restore a sense of embodied presence, community engagement that rebuilds the sense of belonging. 5. Differentiation of the self. Ultimately, Jung saw psychological development as the process of differentiating the self from others, recognizing where we end and others begin, including the crucial understanding that others' behavior reflects their reality more than our worth. The silence that wounds us becomes, in this light, not evidence of our inadequacy, but an invitation to greater self-knowledge, exactly what Jung meant when he wrote that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. As we continue exploring this profound intersection between Jung's shadow concept and our reactions to being ignored, we'll next examine specific patterns of response to rejection, how childhood experiences shape our sensitivity to silence, and practical techniques for transforming these painful triggers into opportunities for growth. For now, we might consider that the next time someone's silence wounds us deeply, they may be doing us an unexpected service, revealing not our unworthiness, but precisely where our journey of integration and wholeness seeks to continue.